All right, why don't we get started? So welcome everyone to the 17th Annual Early Career Scientist Symposium. My name is Shane Dubé and I'm an early career researcher here in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. Today is our second event of 4 planned events on the theme of racial justice and anti-racist research in EEB. And one of the goals of this year's symposium is to showcase work that's pushing our understanding of the links between EEB and society, work that's transforming how we think about our disciplines, how we think about their impacts, their methodologies, how we think about their boundaries. And last week, we kicked off the symposium with 3 amazing speakers, Dr. Alex Moore, Dr. Fuchsia Hoover, and Dr. Stuart Pickett. And if you missed their talks in the panel discussion, you can find the recordings on EEB's YouTube channel. Please check them out if you haven't already. All right, so today we are going to continue what we started. We have an exciting pair of speakers who we are so grateful to have with us today. First, we'll hear from Dr. Nick Gauthier, and then from Dr. Lynette Strickland. And then there'll be a 10 to 15 minute period for questions after each talk. So please type any questions that you may have for speakers below in the Q&A tab, and one of our moderators will share your questions with the speakers. But before we introduce our first speaker, the organizing committee would like to give a few thanks. First, we'd like to thank Nancy Wall for her support and dedication to young scientists. Nancy funded the early years of this symposium and continued sponsorship up until her passing in 2013. And we are grateful for her vision and support. We would also like to thank this year's symposium sponsors and funders. First, the Center for the Education of Women, CEW, which provided support and sponsorship through the Irma M. Wyman Fund. And second, Rackham and their support through a Faculty Allies grant. We are grateful to both CEW and Rackham who have helped make this year's symposium possible. So with that, we have an exciting pair of speakers with us today. Thank you all in the audience for joining as well. And I will pass it over to Dr. Catherine Badgley, who will introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Shane. Can you folks give me a thumbs up if you can hear me all right? Thank you. Great. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker today. Nicolas Gauthier is an anthropologist, geographer, and Earth system scientist who studies human societies. Nick received his PhD in 2019 from Arizona State University and was a postdoc at Scripps Institution of Oceanography and at the University of Arizona before starting his current position as assistant curator of artificial intelligence for cultural and biological diversity at the Florida Museum of Natural History associated with the University of Florida in Gainesville. His interests include human ecology, complex systems, climate dynamics, and socio-ecological networks. He has worked on hydroclimate variability over the past millennium based on tree ring data and on climate reconstruction during the domestication of rice in Asia and Southeast Asia. He specializes in building models of coupled natural human systems, focusing on interactions between population growth, food production, and climate change over the past 10,000 years. His work with collaborators, especially Earl Ellis, on the human impact on terrestrial ecosystems over the past 12,000 years is especially relevant to the themes of our symposium. This work demonstrates, on the one hand, that human societies have been altering global ecosystems for millennia, and on the other hand, that prior to the Industrial Revolution, many of the impacts were not disruptive to native species and ecosystem processes. Consequently, those of us concerned about the current biodiversity crisis should look to the practices of Indigenous communities for insights and certainly involve Indigenous communities in research and policies about conservation. Nicolas's talk today is entitled Putting People in the Earth System. Please join me in welcoming Nick Gauthier. And I'll turn it over to you, Nick. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. Okay, everyone can see that? All right. So I'm going to talk today, I'm going to build on a lot of the themes that we discussed last week and just try to zoom out a little bit to get to a larger spatial scale and a longer time span to see how some of the ideas we've been playing with have played out over the last several thousand years. So since the end of the last ice age and the development of agriculture, humans have become the dominant force in the Earth system. So human cultures and societies are now on a scale equal to that of the atmosphere, the ocean, the land surface, the cryosphere, in shaping the climate dynamics, environmental change, biodiversity, in ways that we seemingly never have before. And the primary nexus of these interactions is through the land surface, is through land use. So we build infrastructure, we build farms and cities that transform the physical landscape. They change the flows of matter and water and energy between the land surface and the atmosphere, altering climate, shifting biodiversity in ways that seemingly haven't happened before, but as we'll show, have happened before. And a useful way to think about all these changes is the idea of anthropogenic biomes. So just like one kind of biome might be a tundra or a rainforest, that thinking about these characteristic human landscapes in much the same way is a really useful frame for modeling and measuring their impacts on our planet over long time spans. So we can think of these anthropogenic biomes as anthromes that represent different interactions between population density and land use. So basically, how many people were there and what were they doing on the landscape? So some obvious anthromes are going to be cities, right? These are totally novel habitats that have unique ecosystems that depend on and interact with human culture and societies in these regions. But smaller scale villages also have very profound effects on their local environment. And so too do the various ways we produce food through agriculture or through pastoralism and grazing. And then almost just as important, but a little bit more difficult to see, is our effect on so-called natural landscapes. So things like woodlands or savannas that may seem to be untouched wilderness, but actually represent these long-term interactions between humans and the environment. So through cultural burning practices, through grazing, or through hunting. And so this lingering paradigm in popular culture and conservation in particular is that all of these changes to the Earth's biosphere through human activity have been mostly recent and inherently destructive. That is, they're the product of the Industrial Revolution and mechanized agriculture. And so when we think about land use, we naturally think of this like large scale deforestation replaced with crop monocultures or irrigating vast swaths of the desert. And this mistaken belief has been the motivation for a lot of really harmful conservation practices, such as those that Dr. Moore talked about last week with this fortress conservation mentality, that if people recently changing the landscape is the problem, then the solution is just to get people off the landscape. And that will magically restore some pristine wilderness that never really existed. And so what I want to do with this talk today is discuss this recently published paper by my colleagues and I, international team of archaeologists and paleoecologists and geographers, actually trying to map out these anthropogenic biomes or anthromes over the last 12,000 years, the entire Earth's surface. So what we're trying to do here is scale up a lot of this local knowledge that we've gathered through interaction with indigenous groups and traditional land managers that say that this idea that just getting rid of people from the landscape is the solution for conservation. We know that's wrong in particular times and places, and we wanted to scale this up to look at the bigger picture, to see how does this actually look like over the last 12,000 years of our species history. And so to do that, we use this fantastic data set called HIDE 3.2, which the maps of past population land use that are currently used in climate modeling. So if you are forecasting climate change in the future or trying to hindcast it in the past, these maps of population land use are what inputted into these climate models. They're how people are represented in the environment and as it's changing through time. And so you get these really nice looking maps like this that show you how different kinds of land use have been changing over time. And this is basically reflecting modern day relationships between population and arable lands. So like, where are the slopes shallow enough to farm? Where is the climate good enough? And trying to push these relationships further back in time than have been previously done. And so this data set goes back to the last 12,000 years. And through it, we can extract a lot of really useful information for understanding these anthropogenic biomes. So things like population density, and then also just the surface area covered by cities, cropland, various land use types, and then also some estimate of the potential natural vegetation. That is, if you had no people on the landscape, what trees and ecosystems would you expect to find at some rough equilibrium with the climate? So we take all this data and then we extract it onto this global hexagonal grid system using this approach very similar. This is how Uber uses maps for their apps, which basically solves a bunch of small problems with how do you map information globally without distorting the shape and scale of that information. So we can use this hexagonal grid system with our high data set of past population land use, and then combine that with this rule-based classification scheme. And this is based on some empirical research by Earl Ellis and Naveen Ramankutty in the last 10 years. That's basically, again, looking at these different threshold levels of population density and various land cover types to classify the landscape, these hexagonal grid cells, into one of these various anthropogenic biomes. So it looks pretty complicated, but if you just follow the flow chart down from the top, you can see it's basically, do you have very high population density, high urban cover, then you're an urban anthrome. If it's moderate population density, but still quite a bit of agricultural land cover, you're one of these various village types, and so on and so forth. Really important for this analysis are these cultured anthromes, which are places with relatively low population density, but still some human influence, either through burning or grazing or very low intensity land use. But then if it's iterated over hundreds or thousands of years, can actually have a very large impact on the environment. And so we have a fairly strict definition of what a true wildland is that has no human habitation and no land use here at the bottom. So we put all these three steps together into an R package. I'll give you guys a link to it at the end of this talk that anyone can use to replicate these analyses. And so we can take this high data for anywhere in the world, extract it to these hexagonal grid cells, and then use that to classify and get these resulting maps of anthropogenic biomes. So then we can scale this up to the entire globe, several million hexagonal grid cells, and we get some really nice maps like this, which you can immediately see is that most of the land surface is anthropogenic in some way. It reflects influences of population and land use in some way. And the only places that are true wildlands, wild woodlands or drylands, these light colors here on the bottom right, are kind of where you expect. They're up in the Arctic Circle, in the Sahara, in these either really dry or really cold places. And that much of the rest of the planet has some human influence. So you'll notice most of the Amazon are these remote woodlands. So we don't have a lot of people living there, but people are still doing stuff and affecting the landscape in some way. So we can push this analysis back in time. And so this chart is basically summarizing the distribution of all these different anthrome types through time. So each bar here is a given time step in the data set. And as we're moving from left to right, we're zooming in time. So we're moving from millennial scale changes to centennial scale changes to decades. And so what you can immediately see, and also this red line here that we're seeing is population through time. So we're looking at the population curve, and we can see that there's a very clear relationship between population and land use. And so what you immediately see is that the wildlands, these true uninhabited lands unaffected by human activity, have remained roughly constant through time. Again, it is places where nobody wants to live and nobody has ever wanted to live. And the real trends, the changes you see through time, is the intensifying of land use, so the expansion of cropland and rangeland in areas that were already inhabited and used by people even 12,000 years ago. So it's an intensification process rather than an extensification process. People aren't really spreading out into new lands. We're using places we've already used more intensively. Now we can take this analysis, this time course, and break it down by different world regions. Here we're looking at these changes in anthrome types based on different natural biomes, so this potential natural vegetation. And we can immediately see, looking at the top four of these charts here, that the temperate and tropical woodlands are almost completely dominated by human land use for the last 12,000 years. Essentially, there is no such thing as a totally pristine rainforest on this planet that has not been touched by human influence in some way at some time in the past. And again, we see the only places that have true, untouched, pristine wildlands are in boreal woodlands and the tundra, in these cold and dry places where you wouldn't want to live anyway. You can also break these analyses out by different areas that are somehow targeted for conservation. So key biodiversity areas, protected areas, things like that. So the only takeaway you need from these images here is that the patterns within these protected areas or key biodiversity areas are essentially the same as for the globe as a whole, that you have long-term histories of population and land use in places that we treat as pristine today. And that is really an incorrect assumption. Going further, we can use these anthromaps to try to predict present day patterns of biodiversity. So what we're seeing here are three different variables of species richness, threatened species richness, and the presence of these key biodiversity areas. And what this chart is doing is showing for each time step, we're using the anthromap from that time step to predict the global patterns of that variable. So what this is saying, so this yellow square right here is saying that the anthromaps in the year 2000 do a very good job of predicting species richness on the globe as a whole. But what this is showing as you start breaking down this analysis and looking at, say, just indigenous lands or just protected areas, that the influence of the past, so of past population land use, is often just as, if not more important or related to present day biodiversity than present day patterns of land use. So that's particularly true here. You can see in indigenous lands that the patterns of anthropogenic biomes thousands of years ago do almost as good of a job as predicting present day species richness as they do in the past. So this is a huge amount of information. It's really difficult to show all these maps. So we put together a Google Earth-based web application for you to go and explore these maps in detail. I'll include this link at the end as well, so you can check it out. And our colleagues at Google set up these very nice guided tours, so you can actually go through and look at key periods of transformation in Earth's history. So just here's an example of the Great Dying. So this is the depopulation of Native North Americans as a result of colonialism and disease from European countries. And so you can immediately see this massive shift in land use over just 100 years here. So I invite you to go check out this map and play around with it yourself and try to see some interesting patterns. So this has been a really helpful exercise. We're taking all this information that we kind of know is true in different parts of the planet and scaling it up to get this unified picture. The one problem with it is that it's wrong, right? These are all models. These are all estimates based on present day relationships between land use and population that we're pushing back into the past. So in recent centuries, that's okay. But as you go further and further into the past, it gets more and more uncertain. But the exciting thing about this is how it's wrong. It's that these data are wrong in that they underestimate how large scale and widespread this transformation was in the past. So if you go and break this information down, say by world regions, you can see in places like Europe here, where we have really high quality data. We know quite a bit about the relationships between land use and population from historical records. It's where a lot of the data that made these models in the first place came from. You see quite a bit of diversity and interesting patterns and long-term histories. But in places in the global South, or even North America, Latin America, and Africa, you see much more stable patterns, which are assuredly, from we know from the archaeological and paleoecological records, are wrong, that we're underestimating how widespread and complex these changes were. So we'd expect, in 10 years, if you were to redo this model, most of the world would look much more like Europe and Asia than it does here. And we can confirm this by looking at the archaeological data. So this is another study we did, surveying hundreds of archaeologists, trying to get their bottom-up view of these dynamics. So asking people who've worked on the ground for tens of years, when do you think, based on your local knowledge, do these transformations begin? And we can see that you have widespread changes to population and land use dynamics very early in the past, based on the archaeological data, and not just in farming or things that we've seen only in the last 12,000 years, but also in the ways of life that came before. So in low density foraging or hunting and gathering, these practices have been going on for way longer than just the last 12,000 years, and potentially just as transformative to the land surface, again, through practices like burning or hunting. And so we're really, based on this archaeological data, we're underestimating how important these processes are. And then the archaeological data are also wrong, because the archaeological data are shaped by legacies of colonialism. From this same survey, we asked people to estimate the quality of the archaeological record, and the number of published excavations. And so you can immediately see where we have good knowledge of the past is heavily biased to only a few world regions. So where we do have archaeological data, it tells us that these things were happening much earlier than we think, but also we have huge swaths of the planet where we just don't know, where there could be widespread, diverse, and complex cultural practices that we just can't really detect today with the current data at hand. And this also shaped, not just in our data, but also in our models and our theory of how we think about human behavior in the past, how we try to fill in the blanks between these archaeological data. This is something that psychology has been dealing with quite a bit, is that a lot of their theories of human behavior are rooted in understanding of modern American college students, not on the full diversity of human experiences. And this is where ecology and evolutionary biology have a huge role to play in diversifying our theories of how humans behave in a way that's both rooted in evolutionary theory, selection, that we intend to maximize fitness in some way, but that fitness maximization is then translated through layers of culture and history and society to get to the real behaviors we see. So we have to complexify and diversify both our theory and the data that we use to understand the past. So even though these models are wrong, they're still useful because they help us visualize our knowledge of the world and what's uncertain, where we still need work to be done. So just some of the key takeaways from this kind of research. So first is that pristine nature is rare. In most of the world surface where we see large-scale land use now is where we saw large-scale land use in the past. True wildlands are places like tundras and deserts where no one has lived in the last 12,000 years. That cultural diversity is biodiversity. That to claim that you want to restore a natural state of nature, increase biodiversity by removing the cultural practices that maintain that biodiversity for thousands of years is just critically wrong-headed. And finally, that we need more diverse models of the human past, both theoretical models, conceptual models, and also these kind of computational models that we used here. So thank you guys for your attention. I just want to thank my collaborators, Earl Ellis and Case Klein Goldwick, and the rest of this Anthrum's 12K team who put all this research together. I also like to thank the conference organizers and speakers today. And if you're interested in any of the data or papers or maps that I showed you today, I've just put some links here. You feel free to screenshot this and follow up with me in the future. So thanks for your attention.
That was terrific, Nick. Let me remind the viewers that if you'd like to ask a question, please type your question in the Q&A, and I will take a look at those and then relay them to him. Why don't you leave this up for a moment longer, Nick? I'm actually going to try to screenshot it myself because I'm very interested in following up here. And then I imagine a lot of people are. And great, that's terrific. And let me start off the questions Q&A with a couple that I was thinking of. And I could keep going indefinitely. So with questions, so please others add some in the Q&A. One is, two questions. One, what surprised you from this study?
That's a great question. I think it's this importance of these cultured wildlands, which actually we used to call semi-natural wildlands, and then caught ourselves that we were still following this false dichotomy between cultural and natural. That these low intensity land use practices. So you can have, like a 10th or 100th of a person per kilometer actually have a really huge impact on ecosystems in general. And then we know that from today, and that we know that was the norm in the distant past too, that people were moving over really wide spans of the landscape, especially if they're these mobile foragers and hunter-gatherers. And that just the everyday things they do to make food or to adapt to that environment have these profound impacts. And again, they're not entirely negative. Very often, especially like cultural burning practices, are increasing biodiversity rather than decreasing it. And so it's just this profound view of how much we don't know, that the further you go back in the past, it looks like things weren't happening because the information hasn't survived the present, not because it wasn't happening.
Great, thank you. And I'll ask another question before we turn to one in the chat. And this is thinking particularly of the graduate students who are even the undergraduates who might be in the audience. What are some of the most critical research questions to follow up on from the research that you presented today?
Yeah,
so if somebody's thinking
absolutely.
about, they're just about to start their dissertation or research and they want to do something that's interesting, novel, and relevant. You have, you're the This study provides all sorts of interesting ideas, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I think it's this idea of scale. And so these models are designed to be global, right? And so they're very general. And so that's where a lot of their failings come from, that generality, but it's also necessary. If you're running a climate model for the planet, you need a global data set. Or if you're trying, if you're at the UN trying to hit global biodiversity targets, you need global data. And so this idea of using these global data sets, seeing where they're wrong, zooming in to local and regional scales, investigating that, and then trying to propagate that information out again is really important. So if you go to that interactive web map and you zoom into any one region, you'll see a lot of weird artifacts and issues with the way these data were put together, which is totally natural. It's just the cost of doing business on such a wide scale. Especially much of my archaeological colleagues, as soon as they got these maps, they zoomed into their single hexagon where their site is and said, like, this is wrong. And that's actually really important, is this idea of science is an iterative process. So we're doing this large scale model just to see what we think is right and where that failed, where that knowledge failed. And so the amount of regional diversity in here is huge. So I think I actually have a slide. Yeah, so this is the same analysis I showed before. So it's the past, how does the past predict the present? But if you break it down by the different world regions, you see there are very different signals going on here, right? Because there's very different cultural practices, ecosystems, climate dynamics at play, but there's just a huge amount of diversity whenever you zoom in on this data. So taking these kinds of large scale approaches, scaling them down to the local level, and then scaling them back up again is just a hugely productive field right now.
Thank you. Let me turn to the chat for a moment. John Vandermeer asks the question, since Homo erectus had control of fire, might the impact of our human evolutionary line have had an even older origin?
100%, absolutely. And it's the same idea. It's like if you have people, not building in stone and burning down landscapes, it's very difficult to detect that. You can get that through like paleoecological data, like through pollen records, but then you need a lake or some place where that would be preserved. And so 100% human use of fire is absolutely profoundly transformative. So when you run, say, these climate models for even like the last glacial maximum, and you try to estimate this natural vegetation, you get forests in Europe, for example, quite a bit. If you look at the pollen data, there are very few forests, even back then. And so what little evidence we know is that absolutely the cultural burning is a huge impact on the global environment.
That's interesting. I've worked in and visited various paleo sites over the last several million years, and I have been in a few places where we also get charred bones preserved in fossil assemblages, which is some of the more conclusive evidence of fire. Another question, Randy Singer asks, is there a way to account for or model differences in land uses? Your research does a good job of modeling human presence and land use, but I'm curious if there are differences in the extent of use and how this might affect the results.
I think what's getting at is, and it's hard to see from this, but the way the anthromes are conceptualized as mosaics, right? So they're patchy, heterogeneous landscapes. And that's, so a cropland can have forests in it. It can have, grazing land. It can have a city in it. It's just what is the predominant land use type there. But again, getting at that low level heterogeneity. And we know like from the conservation sciences that patch heterogeneity and the shape of the matrices and how they're connected are just as important as these larger scale patterns. And so again, this idea of like zooming in and zooming out again is super important.
I have another question, and I encourage viewers to type more into the chat. Were members of Indigenous communities or their networks involved in this research at all?
We had some Indigenous scholar was a co-author in this, and so that they definitely directed us to quite a bit of this research on the cultural burning practices. So that again, you kind of see it from the paleoecological side, thousands to millions of years ago, but actually getting the perspective of what people are doing recently was very important. But beyond that, I think it's something moving forward that we want to do much more with. Again, because we saw these really interesting relationships with Indigenous lands, which have been highlighted before by other researchers, and we're really surprised to find them here because that wasn't at all put into the model in any way. And so using these as tools to actually help and inform conservation efforts in the future is going to be really important. Just to show that, this isn't something that's contingent to a single landscape or a single culture. And there's particular ancestral lands, that this is true for the entire planet.
That's really interesting. And then a companion question, have your findings reached back to the Indigenous communities at all? I mean, I don't think they'll be too surprised,
Yeah,
but
I think
at the same time, I think they'd be very appreciative to know that here's this very quantitative model-based analysis that's showing at the global scale their interactions with native ecosystems.
Yeah, I mean, so Indigenous communities aren't really the target of this because they know all these things, right?
That's a good point.
And this is trying to scale up just to make it visible to people like me who've never farmed a day in their life, actually go and look at it and play around with these maps and see just how widespread this really was and get this visceral appreciation for it.
Great. Another question has been submitted. Would this approach be applicable to the relationship between human populations and water-based ecosystems? I think they're looking for aquatic, whether freshwater or coastal. Or
yes,
for that matter,
I know there's been some recent research in defining aquatic anthromes, and I'm not really up to date on that, but absolutely. And again, getting this idea of like cultural diversity. In the past, we know, many Indigenous groups, such as in the US Pacific Northwest, had extremely complex societies based on fishing, on salmon, to the level of things that archaeologists 50 years ago would have said would be impossible without settled agriculture and hierarchical institutions. And so now we know that that's false. And so again, that's not at all represented in these kind of models. Like there are no fish, there is no oceanic biomass involved. And so again, that's emphasizing just how much more there is to know and to understand and incorporate in these models that we haven't done yet.
Great, thank you. Encourage more questions to come into the Q&A. Let me ask one more question, again, thinking of the kinds of scientists who could participate in future research of this kind. Particularly from the EEB perspective, what kind of training would somebody who wanted to carry some of this research forward need to have? I mean, it looks as though you have a highly interdisciplinary background, and what if somebody's interested in conservation biology but wants to use the perspectives that you presented here, what kind of training and say coursework or skills would you recommend that people acquire?
I mean, people are probably going to hate this, but learning to code. I think that is so many different fields now are developing, these open data sets. Mm-hmm. And so that becomes the key limiting factor is using other fields data sets, knowing how to, import them, process them, like, what does this data file look like? How do I integrate this? So how to integrate this archaeological data with this paleoecological data set, and knowing how to code and do this kind of geospatial data set in an environment where you can easily repeat an analysis or change it at a moment's notice, rather than having to go through like a GIS program and point and click and do everything by hand, but being able to automate this stuff at scale. It's difficult at first, it's a learning curve, but once you're over that hump, then the code that you write for one application, you can change a couple lines and apply it to something else. And it becomes something that grows in and of itself. And so just being able to work with data in general will give you so much access to these open science resources across these different disciplines. And then, like learning about the actual information underlying it, that's collaboration, just talking to people. They're happy to help. And if you have these kinds of coding skills, they will be very happy to talk to you.
It looks like from your, from the article that you referenced by Ellis and yourself and others, that you have this big interdisciplinary group. Is it a group that is persisting? In other words, is it a group that will interact and continue to do research of this sort, say, for years into the future?
Yeah, I mean, not the specific group, but yet definitely many members of it. I mean, this arose from this earlier study, this ArchaeoGlobe, which I referenced, which was this survey of global archaeologists. So a lot of members of that were involved in this as well. And then that team is also continuing on now with a new project looking at island extirpations. So changes in local island biodiversity when humans first arrived. It provides a much clearer, discrete event to study than these global patterns. And so there is this interdisciplinary community of people who are interested in these problems and interacting in real time. And again, the constraint is always the data. So if you want to use archaeological data, that's very different from using ecological data. And so these collaborations are really crucial to surfacing that information and letting it be fully integrated.
Yeah, that's great. I'm part of a couple of collaborative groups of earth scientists and ecologists as well, and they've been extremely beneficial to me. Here's another question that just came in. What is your opinion of some of the most recent mechanistic modeling of human environment interactions? For example, the work of Peter Turchin. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that work, but this has been offered by one of our attendees.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of it. I think that's exactly what we need more of. It's especially that those kinds of models are ecologically rooted rather than economically rooted. And so you can draw on a much broader and more diverse and flexible body of theory that can better understand why people behave the way they do, right? So like the traditional economics view, rational actor theory. So like, I'm going to, mathematically determine what is the right thing to do. And if you don't do the right thing, then you are wrong, right? Not the equations. But the ecological perspective, I think, is a much more flexible view of looking at, proximate and ultimate mechanisms on behavior. So, you have natural selection operating on one time scale, but then, hunger and sex drive and other things operating on other time scales, and how all these different influences interact with one another is a much more flexible perspective on this. And then more specifically, getting to Peter Turchin's work is the role of cultural evolution. So looking at applying evolutionary concepts to how these cultural land use practices have evolved and changed over time.
Sounds very fascinating. Yeah, you wonder with the economic models and their assumptions, what humans they were thinking of. Not any that most of us know. Any further questions from the audience here? We're back to your takeaways and your last slide. Thank you. I'm curious, Nick, have you done any archaeological work yourself or paleoecological work?
Yeah. So I started off as a field archaeologist. So I did some work in the Eastern Mediterranean and Turkey, and then the Southwest US here as well. It's more in the Mediterranean, but I've pivoted to these like larger scale questions just because so many archaeologists do a fantastic job of focusing on a particular region and time period, similar in ecology where you have your study organism, right? And like that information is really crucial. We need people doing that. But then that leaves us this hole in the knowledge of trying to connect disparate locations and time periods and species together. And so that's the niche that I've tried to fill.
Great. Well, it seems like a very unusual and important niche. So we're glad you're in it. And I think we will, unless there's, let's see, we're getting another question here. Let's see if I can find it. Let's see. It says there's one more question, but here we go. Oh, okay, here we go. I have to toggle between a couple of different screens here. What are your thoughts on the mega cities in pre-agricultural times?
Yes, I mean, I think the evidence for that's pretty clear. I mean, so there was this old incorrect paradigm that you need agriculture first before cities, right? So you need this broad base of food production in order to support whatever weird kind of cultural, social interaction we're doing in cities. And increasingly clear that is just not true, that humans are social, interactive organisms by definition. And so the kind of things we see in cities have been happening for a long time, even before you have a physical location. So these kinds of complex societies are the norm rather than the exception. And what cities do is they concentrate all that in place, in a particular place and time. But again, pointing this idea of starting this analysis at the beginning of agriculture misses the majority of human history and the majority of these dynamics. That's exactly the point there.
Great. Wow, fantastic. I think we will wrap up at this point, and let's thank Nick once again for a very, very stimulating and interesting talk. And I will turn things over now to Susanna Campbell, who will introduce our next speaker. And thanks again.